I also want to alert you to a new project that aligns perfectly with tonight's presentation. An Indigenous Cultural Center is being established here in San Miguel to support local Indigenous groups, including Otomi, Chichimeca, Nahua, Huichol, and others, to preserve their language and traditions, to support their communities and economies, and to educate the public. The project is an outgrowth of the 50-year-old Huichol Center for Cultural Survival and Traditional Arts, which was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. Please stop by the information table in the sala and pick up one of the pamphlets. This is a new initiative that's very much worthy of your support. Now to today's presentation. Wade Davis is an anthropologist, author, filmmaker, and explorer. He is professor of anthropology and leadership chair in cultures and ecosystems at risk at the University of British Columbia. He served as explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society for many years, where he was designated an explorer for the millennium. He's been described as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of life's diversity. He's the author of 375 scientific and popular articles and 23 books, some of which have been translated into 22 languages. His photographs have been widely exhibited in books and magazines. He has numerous film credits. A professional speaker for 30 years, Davis has lectured at hundreds of universities, corporations, and professional associations. He's spoken from the TED main stage 5 times, and his talks have been viewed over 8 million times. He is the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and memberships, including recently an honorary citizen of Colombia. Now, I, as a biologist and lifelong naturalist, have always been passionate about conserving threatened biodiversity. Wade Davis has made me care as much about human cultural diversity as I do about natural biodiversity. Won't you please join me in welcoming Wade Davis to IQ.
Thanks, Rob. All right. We're going to, and here we go. One of the intense pleasures of travel, as I'm sure you've all experienced, is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that as we sit here in San Miguel this evening, in the Amazon, jaguar shaman are still journeying beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the high Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world or the culture into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma, an eagle hunter in central Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof shaman in Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting ourselves in social, ecological, and spiritual space. And that's an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of cultures of the world make up a kind of social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is a biological web of life that you know so well as a biosphere. And many years ago, I wrote a book in which I coined the term ethnosphere to try to create a kind of organizing principle for this realm of human life. And I defined the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and ideas, myths and memories, inspirations and intuitions brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative and innovative species. And just, of course, as the biosphere is being severely impacted with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, however pessimistic, could dare suggest that fully half of all forms of sentient life are moribund and on the brink of extinction. It's simply not the case. But that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When each of you in this room were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language isn't just a body of vocabulary or grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes into the material world. I once wrote that every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the very day that you were born by absolute academic consensus amongst linguists, fully half are not being whispered into the ears of infants. They're on the brink of extinction. So we're living through an era when, by definition, half of humanity's social, ecological, spiritual knowledge is at risk. Now, there are many people who say, wait a minute, wouldn't it be better if we all spoke one language? You know, wouldn't we get along better? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? My answer to that is always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that universal language a Nuptatuk. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Tibetan. You begin to see, as a native speaker of English, for example, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry, or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful plight, that fate, occurs somewhere on Earth roughly every fortnight. Because every 2 weeks, somewhere on Earth, some elder passes away and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. Now, the reason this is so particularly poignant is that it's happening in the very generation in which science has finally proven to be true, the interconnectedness of humanity. Over the course of my lifetime, genetics has come to the fore to prove indisputably that race is a total fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We all share the same genetic endowment. In fact, we're all children of Africa, including those who stayed behind and those who walked out some 65,000 years ago, embarking on this extraordinary diaspora that in 40,000 years, 2,500 human generations carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. Race comes down to nothing more than sunscreen and vitamin D. It's no deeper than that. And what does that actually tell us? It really, the significant thing is if we accept that scientific truth that we all share the same genetic endowment, by definition we share the same mental acuity, the same raw potential, the same intellectual capacity. And here's the thing, whether that capacity is expressed through technological wizardry, the great achievement of the West, or by contrast, invested into the challenge of unraveling the complex mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no evolutionary hierarchy when it comes to culture. That old 19th century idea that we somehow went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand of London, that European society sat at the apex of the pyramid that went down to the so-called primitives of the world, has been absolutely debunked by modern science and shown to be a colonial artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the odious notion that churchmen had in that era that there was superiority in culture, or even more practically, that the earth was just 6,000 years old. In this stunning affirmation of the human spirit, science has come to the fore to prove the truth of the greatest dreams of all philosophers and wise women of all time. And what this means, of course, is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture, by definition, is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity. And those answers become collectively our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us in the coming generations. Every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. But the challenge comes, what do you do about this? You know, if you're a biologist and you identify, for example, an area of high species endemism, you can create a protected area, an ecological reserve. But you can't create a rainforest park of the mind. You can't freeze people in time like some kind of zoological specimen. We preserve jam, not culture. And so the question is, when I was recruited to National Geographic with the mandate to change the way the world viewed and valued culture in a decade, we had all kinds of sort of meetings to try to figure out how that might work. And at every one of them, I grew more bored until my eyes simply glazed over. And I finally said, this is not a bureaucratic, it's not an academic, it's not an even philosophical challenge. It's a challenge with the human heart. And polemics are never persuasive. Politicians follow, they never lead, but storytellers change the world. And we are at the best storytelling institution in the world at the National Geographic, so let's go out and tell some stories. And what I had in mind was not to celebrate, as so many, for example, ethnographic films do, the exoticism of the other, but rather to very carefully select stories to tell from the realm of the ethnosphere, where the achievements of the culture were so dazzling that they couldn't help persuade you of the truth of this idea that every culture had something to say. And so this evening, let me take you on some of those stories that carried me for 12, 15 years actually at the National Geographic. I was lucky enough to sail with the Polynesian Voyaging Society on Hokulea, the sacred catamaran named after the Holy Star of Hawaii. And even to this day, the sailors of the Polynesian Voyaging Society can name 300 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls beyond the visible horizon by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel. In the shallows, in the interior of the sleeping compartments of the catamaran, they can sense as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the vessel at any one time, distinguishing those caused by local weather patterns from the deep currents that pulsate across the Pacific and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. And the most extraordinary thing about this technique is that it was based on dead reckoning. That dead reckoning means that you only know where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. And it was the impossibility of using that technique on the open oceans that kept most European transports hugging the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians from an ancient civilization called Lapita off the shores of New Caledonia, ultimately reaching back into Southeast Asia, set sail into the rising sun. Within 1,000 years, they reached Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, and then they stopped for 10 centuries. They lost the ceramic tradition, but not images of the wind, images of the spirit. And then they began to sail again, 4,000 kilometers across the ocean to the Marquesas, southeast to Rapa Nui, northwest to Hawaii, and roughly around the time of the Second Crusade, reaching the shores of Aotearoa, what we call New Zealand. And so in the course of a mere 40 generations, these ancient navigators, the wayfinders, settled the entire known Pacific. And Hokulea sails to this day. Right now, it is circumnavigating the Pacific in the most harrowing journey it's ever embarked on, and has become a symbol of cultural survival. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. Now, if we go from the greatest ocean sphere into the greatest forest on Earth, we enter, of course, the Amazon basin. A forest the size of the continental United States, more poetically put, the size of the face of the full moon. We enter the homeland of the Guarani, this extraordinary culture I lived with in the early late 1970s. They were first peacefully contacted in 1958, though they lived but 125 kilometers as a crow flies from the city of Quito in Ecuador. In 1957, 5 missionaries attempted contact and made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8x10 glossy photographs of themselves in what we would say culturally were friendly gestures, forgetting that the people of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. They picked up these photographs from the forest floor, looked behind the face to try to find the form of the figure, found nothing, and concluded that these were calling cards from the devil, and they promptly speared the 5 missionaries to death. But they didn't just spear outsiders. 54% of their mortality, going back 8 generations, had been intertribal spearing raids. I met an old woman who had been speared back to front, and they had cut off the spear, packed the wound with the mud of the peccary's watering hole. The tissue around the wound had become necrotic, and the spear point slipped out, an indication that this turned out to be the healthiest human society ever documented by science. No common cold, no vector diseases, not even secondary bacterial infections. And they had a knowledge of the forest that was extraordinary. Their hunters could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left it behind. Not because they were sauvage in a Rousseauian way, but rather because they were true natural philosophers who had used all of our human capacity to pay attention to something that was vital to their survival, the very forest homeland in which they had chosen to live out their destiny. And this very kind of perspicacious knowledge of the forest is what we went in search of as young plant explorers. Take, for example, here with the Kofan, Curare, the flying death, you know, the arrow and dart poisons. And these act by being muscle relaxants, so the prey doesn't get poisoned, the prey loses muscular control and collapses from the canopy of the forest. And of course, it was the extraction of D-tubocurare in the 1940s that revolutionized internal surgery in our modern medicine. But the real place where these substances come in to a kind of astonishing focus is in the shamanic art of healing. And the most curious of all are these strange tryptamines. And what this, for example, is a photograph taken in 1954 by my professor, the great Amazonian explorer Richard M. Schultes, and you'll see the Yanomami are blowing something up their noses. What they're blowing is a blood red resin reduced to a powder of several species in the genus Varroa in the nutmeg family. Now these resins are chock full of powerful tryptamines, dimethyltryptamine, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. To have this stuff blown up your nose, as my old friend Terence McKenna said, was rather like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It creates not the distortion of reality, the disillusion of reality. I used to argue with Professor Schultes, who incidentally was the man who sparked the psychedelic era by discovering the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. I used to argue with the professor, you really couldn't classify this as hallucinogenic because by the time you're under the influence, there's no one home anymore to experience the hallucinations. But we're not only interested in these plants for their role in folk preparations, but what they tell us about a different way of knowing. fascinating thing, you've all heard now of ayahuasca, the vision vine, the vine of the soul, probably the most legendary of all the plant preparations of the shaman's repertoire in the Northwest Amazon. But Yahe, as it's called in Colombia, ayahuasca, the vision vine south of Ecuador, is not a plant, it's a combination of plants. Now the reason the Yanomami blow those snuffs up their nose is because tryptamines are orally inactive. You could eat as much as you wanted and you'd have no effect, right? They have to get into the bloodstream or they can be snorted, right? And they can only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other compound that momentarily denatures the monoamine oxidase, which is the enzyme in the human stomach that prevents them from being absorbed. Now, you don't have to worry about the chemistry, but here's the interesting thing. Ayahuasca is a combination of the leaves in a nondescript shrub in the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, chock full of these tryptamines, together with a woody liana in a completely different family of plants that contains in the bark beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines. And again, don't worry about the chemistry, but think about this. How, in a flora of 80,000 species of vascular plants, did the indigenous people learn to combine these two morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create a biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which is quickly statistically reduced to a meaningless euphemism. You ask the shaman, and they say that plants teach you. What does that mean? Well, Schultes in 1941 with the Siona sequoia in eastern Ecuador recorded 17 varieties, folk varieties of the woody liana, all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye as being the same species. And when he asked the people what was the nature of their systematics, they looked at him as if he was a fool. Certainly not a botanist, because any proper botanist would know that you took each of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each variety sang to you in a different key. Now that's not going to get you a PhD at Princeton, but it's a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. And it also speaks to a different way of knowledge. And this really explains the shaman. The shaman is not really a priest or a physician. He's more like a diplomat who is in constant dialogue with the spirit realm. He's more like a nuclear engineer who has to periodically go to the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. And you begin to see how this plays out in the great cultures of the Northwest Amazon. One of the misconceptions we've had always is the Amazon was a fragile place. We always thought that life there was delicate because by the time anthropologists entered the Amazon after World War II in numbers, obviously the main basin had been depopulated for several hundred years. And we were drawn to these quote-unquote real cultures that were living along the margins of the basin, protected from the west from the Andes, from the east by the cataracts and sheer geographical distance. And we had this idea of these cultures like the Guarani in open conflict with their neighbors, living endogenously, living a somewhat precarious lifestyle. And yet when Aureliana goes down the Amazon in 1541, what does he find? Entire civilizations, right? So is there a place where that world can still be felt? And there is, amongst the people of the Anaconda. Unlike the Guarani, the Barasana and Macuna have social structures that facilitate trade and exchange and peace, not war, not the least of which is a marriage rule that says you must marry someone who speaks a different language. These are wisdom traditions. They believe that they came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent with the destiny to reestablish harmony in a world that had been overwhelmed by darkness. And so in these traditions, people are never the problem, we are the solution, because it's only through the human imagination that the wonder of the goddess can be manifest, if you will. The most profound insight of the Barasana is the idea that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. And so they live in these vast malokas that architecturally are as impressive as anything the Inca or the Maya ever constructed, every element of which is a symbol. and at the same time, over the earth itself is a universal maloka anchored in the sacred sites. So ayahuasca or yahe is never used in these societies as is used in the tourism trade of Iquitos for individual growth. It's always a collective experience for the well-being of the people. So in this case, in the wake of a harvest, all the men taking 3 days and 3 nights with the entire people, the man who has created this corona begins by plucking the feathers of a parrot, the breast feathers, and he puts a potion of frog venom and toxic plants on the follicle, and so what was a red feather flushes out yellow, the color of the sun. These aren't symbols of the sun, the rays of the sun. These are the rays of the sun. And in the incredible ceremonies where huge amounts of coke is made, by day, by night, these liminal dances, during which time the entire male population consumes enormous amounts of yahe and then collectively journeys through space, again, not as the ancestor, as symbols of the ancestor, but as the ancestors, to all the sacred sites to reestablish the sense of both harmony, but more importantly, ownership and obligation, reciprocity. Now, the amazing thing, incidentally, is that whole way of thinking could have been lost if it hadn't been for the Colombian government. In 1980, when I first lived with the Barasana in the 1970s, it felt like a very sad place where something had happened a long time before. The power of the missionaries, the military. And then in 1985, President Virgilio Barco in Colombia said to my friend Martin von Hildebrand, do something for the Indians. And in 5 incredible years, Martin did something more than just something. He secured legal land tenure for an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon. And behind the veil of isolation created by the troubles of modern Colombia, a totally new dream of culture was born. So when we made a film with the Barasana, Stephen Hugh Jones, the head of anthropology at Cambridge, flew in, and he had predicted the demise of the Barasana, the disappearance of the Barasana in 1968 in a famous series of BBC films. He comes in, he goes to the Maloka, he sees 150 men in full ritual regalia. He grabs my satellite phone, rushes out to call his beloved wife, Christine, also an anthropologist in London, and he says on the phone, Christine, you won't believe my eyes. All that disappeared are the missionaries. And this is an important point. These societies are not vestigial, which is a big theme of this presentation. But let's take this idea of reciprocity into the Andes. The notion of sacred geography, and I don't mean by that term hippie ethnography, but the idea that the earth is actually alive. Now, we may dismiss that, but in fact, that's how most societies engage the natural world around them. So what happened to us? Well, what happened to us was something really great. It was called the Enlightenment. And in our efforts to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, when Descartes said that all that existed was mind and material, as Saul Bellows said, as science made a house cleaning of belief, we flung out all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, but critically metaphor. And the idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning was dismissed. The idea that a mountain could be a deity was ridiculed. And of course, what's really driven these societies is that very metaphorical idea. So that if I, for example, was raised in Canada to believe that a mountain was a pile of rock ready to be mined, that had a profoundly different impact than to be raised in the mountains of the Andes to believe that a mountain was an Apu deity that would direct my destiny. If I was raised in the coast of British Columbia to believe that the forest existed to be cut, which was the foundation of scientific sustained geoforestry, I had a different relationship to those forests than my brothers amongst the Kwakwaka'wakw or the Haida, raised to believe that those forests were the abode of spirits. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's how the belief system mediates the human interaction with landscape with profoundly different consequences. So in the Andes, such a dynamic place where frost or hail can wipe out the agricultural labor of a year in mere minutes, where landslides and earthquakes are commonplace, the mountains are seen to be alive. One gives the breath, when you exchange coca leaves, you actually take the coca to the four corners and then blow the essence of the leaves to the apu. And the idea is that the essence of the sacred plant goes to the mountains just as water evaporating from the earth becomes cloud that distills into rain. And these ideas are played out beautifully in ritual. I don't know how many people have been to Cusco. Anyone been to Cusco? Did anyone go to Chinchero by chance? Chinchero is a community about 45 minutes from Cusco, which is very unusual because it was never turned into haciendas by the colonial Spaniards. And so it had its traditional infrastructure in place. And once each year, the fastest young boy is given the honor of becoming a woman. And he puts on the clothing of his sister and he becomes known as a Wailaka. And he has to lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You begin at 11,500 feet, you run down to 8,000 feet, and then you run to over 16,000 feet, and then fall away and cross two more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a 24-hour run, which is less a race than a ritual. And the idea is that you go into the mountain as an individual, but through exhaustion, you become a collective. And the word sacrifice means to make sacred. And so the run goes along the perimeter of the community lands, where every so often at sacred mounds of earth, the Wailaka must spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop. Coca is given to Pachamama, libations to the wind. And the beautiful thing is, by the end of the day, the community has reaffirmed both its ownership, but more importantly, its obligations. And at the age of 48, in what my wife calls one of my many midlife crises, I became the first and only outsider ever to run and complete this race. And I only did it by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the history of the planet. But what really got me through is for 30 years I baptized children and educated them, bought cows for the family and pencils, you know how it goes. And every one of my ahijados, when they heard their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they came out to the race and they clung to me all day like limpets. They were not going to let anything happen to their cash cow. But these beautiful localized rituals become pan-Andean in events like the Coyoriti, the Snow Star Festival. Once each year, as the Pleiades re-emerge in the sky, tens of thousands of indigenous people from throughout the Andes gather in a sacred valley known as the Sinicara, dominated by three tongues of the Cocaponca Glacier. And the metaphor is very beautiful. It's a pure expression of syncretic fusion of 500 years of Catholic faith and pre-Columbian antecedents. And so the idea is that you go up into the mountain carrying the crosses from your community. The crosses then are implanted in the ice to absorb the power of Pachamama and then carried back down to the community 3 days later. So it's highly ritualized, and it all occurs in the shadow of the most important mountain of the Inca, El Sangati. And so the Pablitos, who are the ones capable of dealing with the condenados, those condemned in the upper reaches of the ice. And you can see here the crosses being planted in the ice, and in this incredibly solemn, And then, of course, on the third day in the morning at dawn, again, the crosses are carried back down. And the penultimate stage of the ritual is the chipping away of blocks of ice till the mountain actually goes back to the communities for the elders who can't make the pilgrimage, which completes the sacred cycle of the divine. Now, if that's an expression in the southern Andes of the syncretic world of the Andes, and when I was there with my friend Nilda Kalanaupa, who was a fantastic weaver, if you've ever been at the Center of Traditional Textiles in Cusco. I've known Nilda for years. I've been adopted into this community, actually. And I asked Nilda once, how do you feel when anthropologists come along and try to tell you what is pre-Columbian and what's Catholic? And she said, it just gives us a headache, right? But there is one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice is still heard unfettered, and that is in this extraordinary volcanic massif of mountains, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, that soars directly out of the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia to 20,000 feet. And this is the homeland of the Elder Brothers, 4 tribes, Conquama, Wiwa, Arawaco, and Kogi, all descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, and in the wake of the conquest, they fled into the mountains and they reinvented their society as a devotional culture of peace. 500 years after Columbus, they're still ruled by a ritual priesthood. The training for the priesthood is extraordinary. The young acolytes are placed in the shadowy realm of darkness for 18 years, never away from the sacred temple, during which time they're inculcated and taught the ideology of the religious belief systems that maintain that their prayers and rituals literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And after this extraordinary initiation, the young acolyte is taken out before dawn, and he's taken on a journey to the heart of the world, from the temple to the ice to the sea, and back to the temple. And the priest who has trained him all those years is essentially saying, you know, it's yours to protect. It's your obligation. They dismiss the rest of us have ruined the world as the younger brothers, and they speak in full paragraphs of our need to change our ways. Now, that story of the priesthood was kind of a fable in anthropology because it had been reported in 1940 by a great Colombian anthropologist called Michael Domatov, but he hadn't seen it. And one miraculous day in Washington, this man, Danilo Villafaña, with 3 mamos and the Colombian ambassador, walked into my office at the Geographic. And I looked at him and I said, you know, you look like an old friend of mine. And I pulled out a picture of who turned out to be his father, who'd been murdered by the cartels for resisting marijuana plantations. And I said, you know, Danilo, I don't mean to be rude, but when you're an infant, I carried you on my back for weeks with your dad. And it was such a moving that he said, well, let's go. And so I said, what I really want to do is film a journey to the heart of the world. And we did it. And of course, the sacred plant, Hayo, coca, which we can speak about in a moment. As the people move up and down the mountains, they describe their movements as threads. So over the course of a lifetime, you weave a blanket over the cloak of Mother Earth. Here, the teachings in the darkness in the temple, and then the journey to the heart of the world, to Sarangua, the high peaks. And in this incredible massif, every ecological niche in the world is represented. And then back to the sea, where the ritual payments can be made. And at the penultimate stage of our pilgrimage, now 15 years ago, we encountered a FARC patrol that was coming to kidnap us, so we had to escape. And it was Danilo who led us to rescue. And this is an image I took that night of the sentinels watching as we waited to depart. And so that night, Danilo kind of was responsible for the rest of us getting out of the mountains. And here you can see the women making ritual payments. And 2 points I'd like to mention about this. This is Mamo Camilo. I've worked with him for 45 years. And he said to me one day, peace won't matter. La paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados de conflicto pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza. Peace won't matter if it's just an excuse for the 3 sides to come together to maintain a war against nature. As we went to make those payments, he told me President Santos was coming to their village of Namasimake in 5 days, and could I be there to help welcome the president? Well, the only way I could get there logistically was hitching a ride on the presidential plane. So you can't do that in Canada. But in Colombia, everything's possible. So I made some phone calls, friends who made phone calls. Finally, I got a call from the president's office saying, we'd love Profi Davis to come along. So I went down to Bogota. A soldier put me on the presidential plane, and as we flew north, all his aides were peppering him with statistics about what he should say in his national speech. And his speech was going to be broadcast to the nation, and I just put up my hand and I said, you know, I repeated what Mamo Camilo said. And that wonderful man, President Santos, made that the theme of his speech, right? The Nobel laureate. And then here's the sad news. Just on Christmas Day past, in the middle of the night, I got a call, and Danilo was dead. He had died trying to rescue 2 young girls drowning in the mouth of the Rio Palomino. And they'd all been swept in the sea in the terrible currents and they drowned. So as soon as I leave here, a week after here, I'm back in those mountains for a month, and we're going to complete the pilgrimage that we never got to do. So that's going to be very, very emotional. And we're doing this whole thing in memory of Danilo. But let's keep moving here, this idea of the ethnosphere, you know. What about Africa? You know, it's interesting. I worked with Professor Schulte, and I learned that one word in my vocabulary, yes. And having worked 3 years in South America, he summoned me to his 4th floor eyrie at the Botanical Museum, and he asked me if I was interested in going down to the island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies and securing the formula, the folk poison used to make zombies. Well, of course I said yes, having no idea that this assignment that I thought was a lark would consume 4 years of my life. But you know, if I asked yourself, why do we have this notion of voodoo being evil? If I was to ask you to name the great religions of the world, what continent's left out? Sub-Saharan Africa. And voodoo is just a word from the phone language of Dahomey that means spirit or God. It's a quintessentially democratic religion because the believer doesn't just have direct access to the divine, he or she actually becomes the God through spirit possession. The Haitians would always say to me, you white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And so voodoo is simply the expression of powerful religious ideas from that ancient continent. And because when you're possessed by the spirit, you are the God, and a God cannot be harmed, that's why you see these theatrical gestures, cutting into the skin in front of a fetish, or in this case in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance, handling burning embers with impunity, a rather astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. So where did we get the idea of voodoo being evil? Well, first of all, Haiti was the only independent black nation for 100 years. It funded Simon Bolivar on the condition that he free the slaves of Gran Colombia. They bought shipments of slaves destined for the American South and gave them freedom. And then the U.S. Marine Corps occupied Haiti in the 1920s, stayed for 2 decades, and everybody above the rank of sergeant got a book contract. And the names of the books were Black Baghdad, Cannibal Cousins, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, A Puritan in Voodoo Land, The White King of La Gonave, The Magic Island. All these books were filled with children bred for the cauldron, pins and needles and voodoo dolls that don't exist, and of course zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people. And the fear in Haiti is not of zombies, it's of becoming a zombie, because a zombie is a form of social sanction. But those books gave rise to the RKO movies, Zombies on Broadway, Night of the Living Dead, and they suggested to the American people that any country where such abominations occurred could only find its redemption through military occupation. Voodoo is a sublime religious set of beliefs. So the question is, we have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful, are somehow destined to fade away as if by natural laws, as if failed attempts at keeping up, failed attempts at being modern. Nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is no threat to culture. The Sioux did not stop being Sioux when they gave up the bow and arrow for the rifle any more than an American farmer stopped being a farmer when he gave up the horse and buggy for the automobile. It's neither technology nor change that threatens culture. All cultures are always dancing with new possibilities for life. It is power. In every case, these are living, dynamic peoples that are being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation, because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can surely be the facilitators of cultural survival. Now, the book I wrote about the zombies was made into the worst Hollywood movie in history. And Hemingway said that if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw your book over, and go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I disappeared from all that mania and publicity into the forests of Borneo. I always wanted to live in a place wet with the innocence of birth. And I went to live with the last nomadic peoples of Southeast Asia, the Penang. And nomadic societies are profoundly different. Think about it. How do you measure wealth in a society where there's not only no incentive, there's an active disincentive to accumulate anything? Well, in this society, wealth is explicitly defined defined as the strength of social relations between people. Sharing becomes an automatic reflex because you never know who will bring the food to the table next. There's a tremendous prohibition on direct criticism in the social space because, for example, if you have your family and you have your family and we're in a hunting group, an extended family group, if I don't get along with you and the two of us bolt, your kids have a 2/3 less chance of eating tonight, right? So there's a huge pressure on solidarity. I once gave a cigarette to a little old lady and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut of the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. And in these oral traditions, without the written word, the entire vocabulary of the society is the vocabulary of the best storyteller. And the sounds of the wild become a kind of cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. And unfortunately, by the time I reached there in the 1980s, the sounds of the forest become the sounds of machinery. And the highest rate of deforestation ever recorded was sweeping over the homeland of the Penan in a single generation. The rivers that once ran clear were so laden with silt that it seemed as if half of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea. Women forced into prostitution, destitution, children who had never suffered the diseases that afflicted them in the forced settlement camps. And eventually the men had enough and they stood up, a quixotic gesture, blowpipes against bulldozers, no match for the power of the Malaysian state. And today the last of the nomads is gone. And a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, collapsed within a single human generation, just like the forest that had so long sustained it. Now that example of kind of egregious industrial extraction and exploitation as a worldview stands in marked contrast to the civilization that is most different from our own. And that brings us, of course, to the deserts of Australia. We know from studies of the Y chromosome that the ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were the first humans to walk out of Africa. 65,000 years ago, they reached Australia possibly as early as 60,000 years ago, crossing the underbelly of Asia, crossing the open water that then separated still New Guinea from the most parsimonious continent on Earth. They reached that continent and then they went walking. And they established 10,000 clan territories, all linked together by a single idea, and that was the dreaming. The dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a philosophical, devotional tradition that maintained that the world at your feet both existed and yet was eternally waiting to be born. The dreaming was a culture of stasis, not change. Now, when the British arrived, they saw a people who looked strange, had a simple material technology, but what really offended the British is that the Aboriginal civilization had no interest whatsoever in material improvement, no idealization of the idea of change. And the British, because they came from a tradition where that was the very ethos of Victorian Europe, an idea of optimism and change through time that was crushed and died and drowned in the blood of Flanders in the Great War. But during the time of settlement, it was very much alive. And they were so offended by this that the British, in their inimitable way, concluded that the Aborigines weren't human at all. As recently as 1902, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human or not. In the 1950s, you could kill Aboriginal people with impunity who crossed upon your ranch land. There was a quota. In the 1960s, a school book used in the curriculum of the entire country, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, listed the Aborigines as some of the forms of wildlife to be encountered in the outback. Yet what was going on was a devotional philosophy beyond the reach of the British. The dreaming was all about stasis, not change. The entire purpose of life in Australia wasn't to change anything. It was to do the ritual gestures along the song lines, and the song lines crossed the continent, and these were the lines walked at the dawn of time of the ancestors as they sang the world into existence, where the rainbow serpent laid its body, and the whole purpose is to keep the world exactly as it is. It would be as if all of our Western intellectual tradition had focused on pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. Now, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. Clearly, had we followed that intellectual devotion, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon. We wouldn't have developed the genius and the wonder of allopathic medicine. But on the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the biophysical foundation of life on Earth itself. Now, if egregious industrial intrusions can be a challenge, a far more pernicious impact on the cultures of the world is ideology, whether that is the ubiquitous cult of the modern, the myth of the modern, or the heinous materialist Marxist mania of communism. This is a woman, a nun. I shot this in Cambodia. You can see that her feet and her hands have been severed from her body during the era of Pol Pot for the crime of pursuing her religious faith. If we go up into the plateau of Tibet, where I've spent a great deal of time, you begin to understand what it meant when Mao Zedong, the man who incidentally was responsible for the death of more of his own people than Hitler and Stalin put together, when he famously whispered in the ears of the 14th Dalai Lama that all religion is poison, the Tibetans knew what was coming. And as the jackboot of the Red Guard took Lhasa in 1959, 1.2 million Tibetans were killed for their religious faith. 6,000 temples were reduced to riprap and dust. How would we feel if some powerful nation came into our homeland, declared our religious beliefs to be anathema, and proceeded to blow up every one of our churches, temples, and shrines? Well, that's exactly what happened in Tibet. And what was it about the Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists of Beijing? The Dharma is distilled, as you know, in the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life is negation. He just meant that shit happens. The second of the Noble Truths is the notion that the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was the revelation that ignorance could be overcome, and the fourth and most consequential was the delineation of a spiritual path, a devotional path that, if pursued, had not just the possibility, but 2,500 years of empirical evidence that a transformation of the human spirit would occur. So that was what brought me to this man. Has anyone heard the name Mathieu Ricard? He's a translator of His Holiness today. If you look at this picture, you can see that being with Mathieu in the Himalaya for 2 months was like being in Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck. You know, incredible story. His father was France's greatest Descartes philosopher. His mother was a well-known painter. He learned piano from Stravinsky. He learned photography from Cartier-Bresson. He learned anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was himself a molecular biologist studying in the lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute when one day he realized there was no correlation between fame, wealth, and happiness. And he decided to go back to the place he had always been happy, and he became an ordained monk of the Nyingma tradition, the attendant of the great Lama Tyensen Rinpoche. And he's also an incredible writer. He wrote a book called Happiness, which was a bestseller in France. That's something. The French don't even believe in happiness. You know? And he speaks of the science of the mind of Buddhism. And I said, what are you talking about, the science of the mind? And he said, well, you know, what is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? What is Tibetan Buddhism but 2,500 years of direct empirical observation as to the nature of mind? And we wanted to make a film which we called The Buddhist Science of the Mind. So Mathieu, together with this extraordinary traditional Amchi doctor, Sherab Barma, a good friend of mine here seen quizzically examining my urine sample, we had heard about this woman, an old woman that Mathieu was treating. She had quite a history. She had been a beautiful but impoverished young girl, and she had been forced into marriage by her desperate family into the arms of a rather dubious merchant. Instead of that, she fled the wedding ceremony, crawled down a human latrine, and covered with excrement, turned up at the gates of the Temboche Monastery. The lamas cleaned her up and dispatched her over the 19,000-foot Nangpala Pass into Tibet. She then was ordained as a Tibetan nun, crossed back over the pass, and then she went into lifelong retreat as a Satsampa Ani. She had lived 45 years in a single cell far smaller than this stage, reciting every day a single mantra. And Sherab was now treating her in her old age as a doctor. And so that was the stimulus for this incredible journey that began at Shiwang Monastery and Thukten Choin Monastery in a celebration of the Mani Rindu ceremony that commemorates the transmission of the Dharma to Tibet by Guru Rinpoche. And from Shiwang, we made our way through the ceremony and then began this long trek high into the flanks to the environs of Everest. En route, we passed this is actually an unusual photograph of Mount Everest from the east, if you think about it. You're standing on ground higher than any mountain in Europe, looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice that rise to the South Pole. But we passed a cave where Sherab, as part of his 7 years of medical training, had spent 1 year in solitary retreat. And with Mathieu chanting the sutras, we came closer and closer to this nunnery where this woman awaited us. And the next photograph was taken as sunlight fell upon her face for the first time in 45 years. Now, by the terms of reference of our culture, I should have encountered a madwoman. But the face that opened up radiated loving compassion. She began immediately to give away to all sentient beings all benefits of her religious practice. She began to take Mathieu to task for the unnecessarily Baroque rituals of the male-dominated monasteries. And she had spent her entire life in this meditative retreat. And later that night, as we left her to her devotions at a nearby monastery, a lama said to me, this is, actually Mathieu said to me, this is the proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind that is Buddhism, the serenity achieved by the practitioner. And that night at this monastery, a lama said to me, we in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do, And so the Tibetans, of course, turn to the Diamond Sutra and ask the obvious question. Life is fleeting. It's like a candle in the wind. And they ask only that they be permitted to pursue their religious faith. And they ask us why we continue to allow the wrath of China to sweep over this ancient land that has given so much to so many in so many parts of the world. Now, the point of all of this is that we really are asking, what kind of world do we want to live in? A monochromatic world of monotony or a polychromatic world of diversity? Margaret Mead, before she died, said her greatest fear was that as we drifted into this blandly amorphous world culture, not only would the entire diversity of the human spirit be reduced to a more narrow modality of life, but we would forget that there even were other possibilities. The issue isn't the traditional versus the modern. It's the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. The issue isn't to sequester people like specimens in the past, but to find a way that all peoples can benefit from the genius of the best of modernity, but critically without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. And the reason that's so important is not naive romanticism. It's actually geopolitical survival, because culture is not trivial. Culture is not decorative. Culture is not about the clothes we wear, the songs we sing, even the prayers we utter. Ultimately, culture is about a body of moral and ethical values that every society places around every individual to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies within all human beings. It's culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in the universe, to do what Lincoln said, seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, and individuals by coercion or volition turn their backs on their past, often to secure only a place on the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere, you just have to look at points of chaos around the world. The Genocide Museum in Kigali, every conflict is a conflict of culture. Angkor Wat. Has anyone been to Angkor Wat? I know. What was your sensation at Angkor Wat? It's kind of an interesting question. I wandered around Angkor Wat for hours and days. Something was bugging me. I couldn't put my finger on it. And it was only about the 7th day when I realized I had not met anyone my age, because they were all dead. And this man has survived because he lost his leg. Now, mercifully, nation states are finally realizing that indigenous people don't embarrass a nation state, they enrich it if the state's prepared to accept diversity. In my own homeland here in Canada, when the British arrived in the Arctic, the British took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong. But there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in an Arctic environment where everything has to be forged from the cold. You know, a towel left out overnight becomes a shovel by dawn. Tools can be made from human excrement. The runners of the sleds were originally made of Arctic char, fish rolled in a caribou hide. The sleds themselves were made of frozen walrus meat. Newt Rasmussen and Peter Freuchen always said that the best thing about an Inuit is you could always eat it if you ran out of food. This picture was taken, we were hunting polar bear. It was minus 65 that night before the wind came up, Celsius. The guys just made an igloo, the wind came in, blood on ice in the Arctic, despite what Greenpeace says is not a sign of death, it's an affirmation of life itself. And while I was narwhal hunting once, the tip of, when I say hunting, I'm not pulling the trigger, I'm just with them, right? But a kind of a prophetic story, but this man, Olayak, told me a story from a dark period of Canadian history when we were forcing Inuit into settlements to establish our sovereignty after World War II, and his grandfather refused to go. So the family took away all of his tools and weapons, thinking that it would force the man to succumb. Instead, the old guy got out of the igloo in the middle of a storm, pulled down his trousers, defecated into his hand, and as the feces froze, he shaped it in the form of an implement. And when the Inuit call it shit knife took final form, he killed a dog with it, he skinned the dog with it, and then improvising the traces of a sled with a living dog and the carcass of the dead dog as a sled, he disappeared in the Arctic night. Now, I thought they were pulling my leg, but the truth is Peter Freuchen talks about getting trapped in the barren lands, pulling over his sled, being trapped in the coffin of his own making, and his journalist says, I thought of making a shit knife, but I couldn't really maneuver. You know, this is not to say there's an assembly line of making shit knives in the Arctic. The point is that feet cold is not your enemy, it's your friend. And just when the lifeway of the Inuit people has finally been protected with the generation of the new homeland of Nunavut, half the size of Western Europe, now, of course, there's something beyond their capacity to deal with, which is climate change, unfortunately. This is a photograph taken the northernmost community in the world of Kanak. And so finally, one last story to end on a more positive note. After 9/11, I wanted to make a story about Islam. So I went to Mali, lived with the Dogon in the Bandigas Escarpment, who are not Islamic, and made my way to the great Islamic centers of Jinnah and, of course, Timbuktu. Timbuktu, which is the great port on the Sea of Sand of the Western Sahara at the northern bend of the Niger River. Timbuktu, at one point, when Paris and London were mud hovels, had 25,000 university students. The only reason the knowledge of the ancient Greeks survived to inform the Renaissance is that it was held in a repository by the great Islamic scholars. And in Timbuktu, you can hold in your hands ancient manuscripts in botany, cosmology, science, chemistry, logic, philosophy, printed by, embossed in gold in the 13th century, copies of things that go back to the 10th century. And part of what we wanted to do is celebrate this repository, which we were able to do very effectively, but more importantly, we wanted to go north, following the ancient route to Marrakesh. Until the discovery of the New World, fully 2/3 of Europe's gold came from equatorial West Africa, overland through Timbuktu, and eventually to Marrakesh, 52 days across the desert. And in the middle of that route is an ancient salt mine called Tadeni, which has been worked since the 8th century. And to get there, you follow the sand. And the guides say that if they ever get lost, they simply sit still and wait for Allah to tell them the way. You cannot marry if you're a Tamashek or a Berber if you have not done this 24-day back and forth journey to the ancient salt mine. The salt wasn't a condiment. It traded ounce for ounce for gold throughout the pre-colonial era. It was seen as a sacred essence of the desert. And so we went up to this ancient mine to tell this sort of beautiful story of the Sahara and Islam. It was during the Torah rebellion, so we kind of had to have these guards with us, and we kept getting more and more of them. I had no idea what anyone was doing, but every day it was so beautiful in the absence of water to see these beautiful men turning east to Mecca and washing themselves with the sand of the Sahara. And we eventually got to the mine, which was a totally biblical scene. My friend Iso Muhammad, a great Torah man, took one look and he said, "I would not bring my wife here." I asked some of the guys there what country they came from. They said, "There are no countries here." And while we were at the mine, two things happened that I'll leave you with. One, we encountered this man who in his youth had fallen into debt peonage, borrowing money from a moneylender in order to save the life of his daughter. He was at the mine trying to work off that debt. And by his age, he was younger than me, but physically much older. And looking at his production and looking at his age, it was clear he was never going to escape this debt, never see his family again. And his total debt was the cost of a meal in Toronto for 3. So I gave him the money, and as I gave him the money and as he blessed Allah, suddenly a sandstorm just swept through the mine site, and he was just enveloped in this haze of golden yellowish mist. I never found out whether he was telling me the truth. Did he get back to his family? Was he killed for the money? But then as we made our way south into the desert, we came upon a caravan of these young men who had been stuck in the desert because an unusual rain shower had broken the Saharan sky, and if the salt gets wet, it breaks and loses all value. So they were stuck 250 miles from the nearest well, down to 1 single liter of water. They had just sent this fellow, when I took this picture, he was going off to try to dig for water 25 miles away. And in the desert, you can survive without food for a fortnight. Without water, you can die overnight. In fact, the truck smugglers have a great expression. They say the great thing about brake fluid is it keeps you off the battery acid. And so we came upon them, and what did they do with their last liter of water? They immediately kindled a twig fire and brewed us tea, honoring the Bedouin adage that you will always kill the last goat that keeps your children alive with its milk to feed or support a wandering stranger who comes into your midst in the middle of desperation, because you never know when you will be that person in need approaching a Bedouin encampment. So when I watched Muhammad pour me that first cup of tea, I thought, this is why I've done this work, because these are the moments that in a dark world allow all of us to hope. Thanks.